the Duke of Rexford said it in French, to the drawing room at large, in a voice pitched exactly loud enough to be overheard and exactly soft enough to be denied afterward, that it seemed the young person pouring the negus understood not one word said in her hearing, which must be convenient indeed for a girl kept about the house to listen. Verity Ashe set the tray down without a tremor, met his eyes over the rim of Lady Vale's cup, and answered him in the same tongue, in the same breath, correcting the tense he had gotten wrong along the way. She did not yet know that the sentence would follow her into a room full of magistrates 6 weeks hence. Had she known, she would have said it anyway, and rather more precisely. The room went still in the particular way a room goes still when it has just watched someone lose a duel they did not know they had entered. Teacups paused at lips, a fan stopped its slow beating, and somewhere near the window Lady Honoria Vale's laughter died half-formed. Verity finished her sentence in English. For the benefit, she said pleasantly, of those in the room who owned only the one language and repeated the substance of what she had told him, that a spy content merely to listen learned very little, whereas a spy who also read learned everything, and she was told upon her hiring that she had been engaged expressly to read. The Duke did not smile. He was not a man who smiled easily, not since the spring 2 years gone that had taken his wife, and the child neither of them had yet named, and the household had learned to read the weather of him the way sailors read a sky, by small signs, by the set of a jaw, by how long the silence ran before he spoke again. He turned the ring on his smallest finger once, the old habit that meant he was choosing his next words with more care than the last, and said only that Miss Ashe might finish her rounds. It was the 1st of August, and the heat that summer lay over the valley like a hand pressed flat, and everyone at Rexford Hall would remember, afterward, that it had been the hottest week anyone could recall when the trouble began. Verity was 22, plainly dressed in gray worsted, with the cuffs turned twice to hide their mending, and she had been at the hall 11 days, hired by the steward's office to catalogue the late Duchess's library of French correspondence, a task everyone below stairs agreed was a strange use for a girl who carried trays at need and slept in the room above the still-room. She was, in fact, exactly the person for the work, though no one in that drawing-room save the housekeeper knew why. Her mother had been born in Rouen and had taught her daughter to read Racine before she could properly hem a seam. Her father had kept ciphers and accounts for great houses for 20 years before Rexford Hall dismissed him, 8 years past, for theft he had not committed, and had died of the shame of it within the year, his name unrepeated in that house ever since. Verity had taken her post under her own name because she had not the imagination to invent another, and because some stubborn part of her had wanted, however foolishly, to walk back into the rooms that had ruined him. She had 6 weeks. The estate's trustees were to gather at Michaelmas to review the accounts of the Rexford bequest, the fund that clothed and schooled the orphan sons of the county's soldiers, and it was in the ledgers of that same fund 8 years before that her father's name had first been written down as a thief. She meant to be gone from the hall, proof in hand or not, before that day came. She did not mean to be noticed doing it. She had certainly not meant to be noticed like this, correcting a duke's French before 40 witnesses, but there was a thing in her that would not, when tested, lie down and play the servant, and she had known this about herself long enough to stop being surprised by it, and had not yet learned to stop paying for it. She found the housekeeper, Mrs. Bramwell, in the still-room that evening, straining a cordial through muslin, with the brisk contempt of a woman who considered most household crises beneath comment. Verity took a stool without being asked, and admitted, because there was no one else in that house she trusted to hear it plainly, that she had perhaps just ruined 11 days of careful invisibility in the space of one sentence. Mrs. Bramwell did not look up. Pride, she said, was a luxury for people who could afford the bill, and Verity should know better than most what the reckoning cost. And then she said that in 30 years of service, she had never once seen his lordship bested in a public room, and that she would give a month's wages to have watched it happen. There was warmth under the tartness, the way there generally was. Mrs. Bramwell's affection ran along a vein of insult, the way a river ran along stone, and Verity had learned in 11 days to read it. She asked, carefully, what manner of man the Duke had been before his losses, and the older woman set down her muslin and said that he had been a great one for laughing, once before the war took his brother, and the spring before last took the rest of what he had left to lose, and that a man who has buried his laughing does not necessarily bury his kindness with it, whatever the drawing-room believed. Verity turned this over the way she turned over most things, privately, at length, storing it against future use, and said that she had not come to the hall to make a study of its master. Mrs. Bramwell said, dryly, that she was glad to hear it, as she had not asked, and then asked why, precisely, a girl who read Latin and kept her own counsel wanted a post cataloguing 40 years of dead women's letters, and Verity, who had rehearsed a dozen answers to this question and trusted none of them enough to use them on this woman, said only that some debts were paid in coin and some were paid in patience, and that hers was the second kind. It was, she would think later, the first time she had come near to telling the truth in that house, and she had told it in the shape of a maxim rather than a confession, which was, she supposed, the only shape she yet trusted. Mrs. Bramwell studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that priced a person rather than judged them, and said only that patience, in her experience, ran out exactly when it was most needed, and that Verity had best find her proof, whatever it was, before Michaelmas closed the account. It was the first anyone in that house had named the date aloud to her, and Verity understood, hearing it said in that flat, practical voice, that the housekeeper had known, or guessed, rather more than she had let on, and that the clock the whole county called Michaelmas had just begun, in that still room, to tick for her as well. The Duke sent for her the following morning, which surprised no one so much as it surprised Verity herself, who had spent the night composing 3 separate apologies and discarding each as either too abject or not abject enough. She found him in the estate office rather than the drawing-room, coat off, sleeves turned back, a ledger open before him that he closed the instant she entered, which she noted and said nothing of. He did not offer her a chair. He said, without preamble, that he had not summoned her to be scolded, whatever she had braced herself to receive, and that in point of fact her French had been better than his own, which he supposed she already knew, since a woman who corrected a duke's grammar in front of 40 guests did not generally do so from modesty. Verity said that she had not corrected him from modesty, she had corrected him from accuracy, and that the two were not, in her experience, often found in the same sentence. Something moved at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, and did not survive long enough to become one. He asked where she had learned the language so well that she thought it worth the risk of using it against him. She told him, because it was easier than lying, and because some obscure instinct told her lying to this particular man would cost more than it bought, that her mother had been French, and that she had been taught to read before she had properly learned to write her own name in English. He absorbed this the way she was coming to understand he absorbed most things, in silence, turning it over before he spoke again, and said that it explained a good deal, and that he supposed he ought to apologize for testing her as though she were a parlor trick rather than a person, since he had, by his own account, behaved rather badly. It was not an easy apology. It came out of him the way water comes out of a stone, grudging and real. Verity, who had not expected one at all, said that she accepted it, and added, before she could stop herself, that in future he might simply ask a question in whichever language he liked, in French or in truth, and receive an honest answer either way. He looked at her for a moment that ran a beat too long to be comfortable and said that he would remember the offer, and she left the office with the distinct and unsettling sense that she had just handed a dangerous man a phrase he intended to keep. The county did what counties do with a good story, which was repeat it with interest. Within the week, it was known from the vicarage to the last tenant farm along the river that the young person cataloging the Duchess's letters had put his lordship in his place in his own drawing room, and opinion divided neatly between those who found this delightful and those, rather more numerous among the callers who came hunting the Duke's unmarried attention, who found it insufferable. Lady Honoria Vale belonged, unmistakably, to the second camp. Though she was too well bred to say so plainly, she instead made a habit, whenever she called, of addressing Verity in French herself, swiftly and with a great many idioms, watching for the smallest hesitation the way a hawk watches a hedgerow, and finding none, which pleased her not at all. Verity bore this with the composure she had spent a lifetime perfecting, the folding of one hand over the other, the pressing of a thumb into her own palm where no one could see it, a private arithmetic that kept her face still while her pulse did as it liked. It was in the third week, cataloging a shelf of the old Duchess's correspondence in the library's north alcove, that she found the first thing that made her stop being merely careful and start being afraid. Tucked inside the marbled boards of a schoolroom exercise book, a child's copy of French verbs in a hand she recognized before she had even finished turning the page. Because it was her own father's hand, small and upright and economical with ink, was a column of figures that matched nothing in any ledger she had yet been shown, set beside a column of ordinary translation exercises, as though hidden in plain sight among a dead woman's keepsakes. She closed the book, set it back precisely where she had found it, and stood a long moment with her palm flat against the shelf, breathing, telling herself that a column of figures proved nothing yet, that she had 6 weeks and a great deal of work before it proved anything at all. She was still telling herself this when she heard, from the passage beyond the alcove, low and unhurried, and not meant for her ears, the voice of Mrs. Cordelia Thorne asking Mr. Fenn, the land steward, whether the Michaelmas rentals had been burned as she had told him, and Mr. Fenn answering that they had, every page, and that he would thank her not to raise her voice about it in a house with so many doors. Verity did not move. She had learned, in 11 years of being overlooked, that stillness was the only weapon available to a person no one thought worth watching, and she used it now, memorizing the voices, the hour, the precise words, filing them away the way her father had once filed away figures no one else thought to check. Cordelia Thorne was, by any honest account, the most beautiful woman under that roof, and she knew it the way she knew the hour by the light, without vanity, as a simple fact to be used. She was the late Duke's niece by marriage, widowed young when her husband's debts outran his health, and she had run Rexford Hall's household accounts for 6 years, with a competence everyone praised and no one examined, ever since the old Duchess's death had left a hole in the domestic order that Cordelia had filled so smoothly no one thought to ask how she had come to fill it. She had a habit, when she lied, of smoothing her gloves finger by finger, working the kid leather flat as though ironing out a crease that was not there, and Verity, who watched hands for a living now as she had once watched them for love of her father's trade, had marked it within a fortnight without yet knowing what it meant. It meant, she would come to understand, a great deal. Cordelia found her that same afternoon in the alcove, ostensibly to ask after the progress of the cataloging, and stood near enough to the shelf that held the exercise book to make Verity's pulse quicken before a word was spoken. She said, in the gentlest voice in any room she occupied, that she hoped Miss Ashe was not overtaxing herself among so much old paper. That some corners of a great house were better left undisturbed, out of respect for the dead, if nothing else. It was said with a smile, and it was, Verity understood at once, a threat wearing a smile's clothes, the softest voice in the house delivering the sharpest warning it had yet given her. She answered, evenly, that she had always found the dead better company than the living gave them credit for, since they at least kept their accounts honest, and watched Cordelia's smile hold perfectly steady while her gloved hands, at her sides, went still in a way that told Verity more than any answer could have. The deadline she had carried privately for 3 weeks now had a face attached to it, and the face was smiling at her and asking her, very sweetly, to leave well enough alone. It was the shared trouble of the library, oddly, that thawed what public embarrassment had frozen between Verity and the Duke, for he took, in the 3rd week, to reading in the same north alcove of an evening, ostensibly to oversee the cataloging, and in fact, Verity came to suspect. Because the room held fewer memories of his wife than the rest of the house, and had therefore become one of the few places in it where he could sit without his face reporting what it cost him to be there. They fell into an uneasy companionship over the sorting of 40 years of letters, trading small confidences, the way 2 people trade coin they are not yet sure is legal tender between them. He told her, one evening, without being asked, that his brother had died at a river crossing whose name he still could not say aloud without his jaw setting, and that his wife had died in the room directly above the one they sat in, and that he had not slept there since. Verity, who understood the particular discipline of speaking of grief in a level voice, said nothing consoling, offered no soft noises, only asked what his brother had been like before the war, which was, she had learned from long practice on herself, the only kind of question grief could bear to answer. He talked for a quarter hour about a boy who had once put a frog in the vicar's tea-urn, and somewhere in the telling he laughed, briefly, a rusty, surprised sound, as though the mechanism had not been used in some time and had forgotten its own working, and Verity marked the moment the way she marked all things now, filing it without quite knowing why it seemed to matter that she had heard it. In exchange, carefully, in pieces, she told him that her father had once worked in service to a great house, that he had died disgraced, that she did not believe the disgrace deserved, and stopped there, offering him the shape of the wound without its name, watching him accept the omission without pressing at it, which she took, rightly, as its own kind of courtesy. "There is a debt," she told him once, testing the shape of the words she had inherited from her father and had never before said aloud to anyone who might understand their weight, that cannot always be paid in the coin it was borrowed in. Some debts want patience instead, and patience is a currency few houses keep in stock. He turned the ring on his finger and said that Rexford Hall, whatever its faults, had never yet been accused of stinting its household on patience, and Verity, watching him say it in perfect good faith, thought of the exercise book on its shelf not 4 feet away, and said nothing, and felt, for the first time since her father's death, the particular loneliness of holding a truth that the person beside her most needed to hear. The blow came at the harvest supper, which Rexford Hall held each September for every tenant on the estate, a tradition old enough that even Cordelia had not thought to alter it, and it came from a direction Verity had not thought to guard. She had spent the intervening fortnight matching figures from the exercise book against the trust's public accounts, quietly, in stolen hours, and had begun to see the shape of what her father must have seen 8 years before, rents recorded as paid that tenants swore, when she asked them idly over cider, they had never been asked to pay twice. Disbursements to the orphan boys' school that the schoolmaster, questioned just as idly, said had never reached him in half the sum, claimed she had not yet found the second half of the proof, the piece that would tie the figures to a hand rather than a mystery, and she had told herself she had time. She did not have time. Cordelia rose during the supper's toasts, glass in hand, smoothing one glove before she spoke, and said, with an air of great and reluctant regret, that she felt it her duty, however painful, to mention that certain papers had gone missing of late from the estate office, and that she had learned, to her sorrow, that Miss Ashe, the young person hired to catalogue the library, was in fact the daughter of the very man dismissed 8 years past for theft from this same bequest, a fact Miss Ashe had, Cordelia said, taking care to keep her voice gentle and her face full of pity rather than accusation, neglected entirely to mention upon her hiring. The hall went silent in the particular way it had gone silent once before, in a drawing room in August, save that this time the silence was aimed at Verity rather than shared with her. She felt every asset she owned turn, in a single sentence, into a weapon pointed back at her own throat, her competence with figures now proof of a thief's daughter's cunning, her quiet hours in the library now evidence of a plan long laid, her very presence in that house recast, in the space of one gentle, regretful toast, from an overlooked girl doing careful work into a scheme 8 years in the planning. She did not weep. She set her cup down with a hand that did not shake, though it cost her a great deal to keep it steady, and said only that she was, indeed, Josiah Ashe's daughter, and that she had not thought her parentage anyone's business until it was made so, publicly, by a woman who had known it all along and chosen this room, this night, to spend it. The Duke, at the head of the table, had gone very still, the ring forgotten on his finger, his eyes moving from Cordelia to Verity, and back with an expression she could not read and did not have the composure left to try. And it was in that silence, with 60 tenants watching and no ledger yet in her hand to answer the accusation, that Verity understood what looked all this, while like the safety of quiet work had been, from the first, a trap only now sprung shut. She was given, the following morning, what Mrs. Bramwell called with some bitterness a golden door, which was the offer, delivered by Cordelia herself with every appearance of kindness, of a character reference, a full quarter's wages, though she had not completed the quarter, and a coach to the county town, all contingent delicately upon Miss Ashe's understanding that certain old matters were best left where the years had put them. It was, Verity understood at once, not an offer at all, but a bribe dressed in Charity's clothes, the price of her silence set out on the table as plainly as a merchant's bill, and she was standing in the estate office with the paper of it actually before her. A settlement drawn up in Cordelia's own careful hand, when she thought of her father, dead 8 years of a heart broken by exactly this kind of silence, bought from someone too poor to refuse it, and found that she could not, whatever it cost her, become the second person to sell his name for a coach fare and a quarter's wages. She said no. She said it once, plainly, without embellishment, and watched Cordelia's face perform surprise so smoothly that only the gloves, smoothed twice in quick succession, gave away that the surprise was not real. She said that she would not be leaving Rexford Hall until Michaelmas, when the trust's accounts came before its trustees, as they did every year, and that she would take her chances, whatever they cost her, on being present in the room when they were read. It cost her, in the following days, precisely what she had known it would. The household's warmth toward her curdled overnight into wary distance. Servants who had shared gossip with her a week before now crossed rooms to avoid her, and even Mrs. Bramwell, loyal as she was, warned her plainly that refusing a golden door rarely left a person anything but the cold to stand in. Verity told her, with more conviction than she entirely felt, that a debt paid in patience was still owed in full, whether or not anyone thanked you for the waiting. And Mrs. Bramwell, unmoved by the sentiment, and moved considerably by the girl beneath it, brought her a second blanket that night without being asked, and said nothing further on the subject, which was, from that particular woman, very nearly an embrace. The dismissal, when it came 4 days later, was swift and total and dressed, like the bribe before it, in the language of regret. A volume was found missing from the library's north alcove, the very exercise book Verity understood with a cold drop in her stomach when she was shown the gap on the shelf, though she had returned it to its place not 2 days before, and had no notion who had taken it since, and Cordelia stood before the Duke in the great hall, gloves smoothed, voice grieved, and said that she took no pleasure whatever in confirming what the county had already begun to suspect, that a book bearing figures in a disgraced man's hand had vanished from this house at precisely the moment his daughter stood accused of concealing her connection to it, and that however fond the household had grown of Miss Ashe, fondness could not be permitted to outweigh the safety of the Duchess's collection or the good name of the bequest. The Duke did not look at Verity while this was said. She would remember that, afterward, longer than almost anything else that happened in that hall, not his anger, which she might have borne, but the 2 full minutes in which he looked instead at his own hands and said nothing at all, weighing, she understood only much later. Not her guilt, but his own long habit of deciding such matters alone, rather than asking the one person in the room who might have told him the truth of it. He said finally, in a voice gone careful and formal in a way she had not heard from him since the drawing-room in August, that he was obliged, given the circumstances, to release Miss Ashe from her position pending the matter's resolution. She was given an hour to gather her few things. She spent most of it standing very still in the small room above the still-room, pressing her thumb into her palm, telling herself that this was not, after all, so very different from the ruin her father had known, and that if she had inherited nothing else of his, she had at least inherited the composure to survive it. She was folding her second dress into her single trunk when Mrs. Bramwell came in without knocking and pressed into her hand a letter that had arrived, she said, that very morning, addressed to Verity in a clerk's careful hand from a solicitor's office in the county town, and said only that some doors closed themselves and some were closed for you, and that Verity had best read the letter before she decided which kind this one had been. Verity broke the seal with hands that were, for the first time in 11 weeks, not steady at all, and read a single line that stopped the breath in her chest entirely, that Mr. Aldous Price, formerly the elder Mr. Fenn's clerk, and the only other soul who had handled the bequest's accounts 8 years before, had, upon his recent deathbed, made a sworn statement naming the true author of the missing rents, and that the solicitor holding it awaited only Miss Ashe's instruction as to whom and when it ought to be shown. She did not go to the county town. She went, instead, at first light, with the letter folded inside her bodice and the last of her courage folded around it, to the one place in the county she could be certain Cordelia Thorne would not think to look for her, back to Rexford Hall itself, in through the still-room door Mrs. Bramwell left deliberately unbarred, because the housekeeper had decided, in her own blunt fashion, that a woman thrown out on a lie deserved at least a fighting chance to prove it one. Verity found Mr. Fenn alone in the estate office before the household was properly awake, sorting rent books with the hunched, joyless diligence of a man doing work he hated for a mistress he feared, and she did not waste the advantage of surprise on pleasantries. She told him, plainly, that she held a dying man's sworn word, naming the hand that had falsified the bequest's accounts 8 years past and again this year, that Mr. Price's statement named a steward's cooperation as well as a mistress's instruction, and that the only question remaining, in her estimation, was whether Mr. Fenn intended to be tried alongside Cordelia Thorne at Michaelmas, or to be the man who had, at the last, told the trustees the truth. Fenn's hands, she noted, had gone entirely still over the ledger, the first time in 3 months she had seen them anything but restless, and it was in that stillness, more than in anything he said, that she read the crack beginning in him. He did not confess, not then, not fully. He was too frightened of Cordelia's reach to give her more than a look that held more fear than denial in it, and a single sentence, low and hunted, asking what proof, precisely, she thought she held. Verity told him only that he would learn its full shape at Michaelmas, along with everyone else, and left him sitting there with his hands still and his face gray, satisfied that she had planted, if not yet a confession, at least the seed of one, and turned to find the Duke standing in the office doorway. Having heard, she understood at once from his face rather more of the exchange than she would have chosen to let him hear. He had come to the office at that early hour, he told her, once Fenn had fled the room with the particular haste of a man glad of any excuse to be elsewhere, because he had spent the 4 days since her dismissal doing his own quiet accounting of the household ledgers against his memory of his father's old records, driven by a discomfort he had not been able to name until he heard Cordelia's voice in his mind smoothing over one detail too many, and had found, on his own, 3 discrepancies he could not explain, and 1 entry in his father's hand, from 8 years before. Noting that Josiah Ashy's dismissal had troubled him more than he had ever said aloud. He had been coming, he admitted, to find Verity and confess as much, and had found instead the tail end of a scene that told him she had been doing, alone and dismissed and disbelieved, precisely the work he ought to have trusted her to do from the first. He said, and it cost him visibly to say it, that he had spent 2 years deciding alone who might be spent to protect whom. His brother's memory, his wife's grief, now Cordelia's long service to his mother's memory, and that the habit had very nearly cost him the one person in that house who had never once asked him to protect her, only to believe her. Verity, who had rehearsed anger at him through 4 cold nights and found it dissolving now faster than she could hold on to it, said only that belief was easier to offer once the proof was in hand, and that she did not yet have enough of it to make believing easy for anyone. He asked what she needed. She told him the second half of the cipher, the piece that would tie a column of figures to a hand no dying clerk's word alone could fully prove, and a room full of the bequest's trustees on Michaelmas Day, and one precise question asked of Mr. Fenn in front of all of them. At the moment, his fear of the law finally outweighed his fear of his mistress. The Duke turned the ring on his finger, once, and said that Michaelmas fell in 4 days, and that between them they had better find the second half of that cipher before the sun set twice more, and Verity, hearing him say between them, felt something in her chest ease for the first time since the harvest supper, a small, unlooked-for warmth she did not yet have leisure to examine. They found it on the second night, in the library's north alcove, in the binding of the very schoolroom exercise book everyone had believed stolen, which Mrs. Bramwell, it transpired, had quietly removed and hidden the morning of the accusation, on the theory, entirely correct, that a book no one could produce could not be used as evidence against the girl accused of losing it. Verity slit the marbled boards with a paper knife under candlelight while the Duke held the flame steady, and found, pressed flat inside the binding where her father had hidden it 8 years before, a second sheet in the same economical hand, blank to the eye until she held it, at his soft instruction, close enough to the candle's heat that the lemon juice ink he had used to write it. invisible in daylight, browned slowly into legible figures under the warmth, a full accounting, dated and witnessed in his own hand, of every sum diverted from the bequest in the year before his dismissal, matched precisely against the false totals recorded in the household's public ledgers, and signed, at the bottom, not with her father's name, but with the initials CT. Copied faithfully, he had noted in the margin in his careful clerk's script from the very instructions he had been ordered to falsify, and had instead preserved. Verity sat a long moment with the paper trembling very slightly in her hands, the only trembling she permitted herself, and said, half to the Duke and half to the ghost of the man who had waited 8 years in a book's binding to be believed, that her father used to tell her that a ledger kept 2 columns, what was owed and what was worth, and that a man could lose the first and still keep the second only if he never let a lie be written down as truth in his own hand. The Duke, watching her in the candlelight with an expression she had no leisure that night to name, said quietly that he understood, now, precisely what had been owed in that house for 8 years, and that he intended to see it paid in full before Michaelmas ended. Michaelmas Day gathered the county's business into the great hall of Rexford Hall in the old way, trustees and tenants, and the vicar and Sir Robert Cray, the magistrate who sat, by the terms of the founding charter, as the bequest's neutral overseer, all assembled beneath the same beams that had heard Cordelia's gentle accusation not 3 weeks before. Cordelia herself sat near the Duke, composed, immaculate, a lace shawl about her shoulders against the first true chill of autumn, and opened the proceedings, when her turn came, by presenting the year's accounts in a hand so steady and a voice so warm that Verity, watching from the room's rear where she had been permitted to stand only at the Duke's insistence, felt for one cold moment the whole architecture of her father's proof might simply slide off this immaculate surface and be believed a forgery in its turn. It was Sir Robert who called, formally, for any person present with cause to question the accounts to speak now, or hold their peace, and it was the Duke who rose first, not Verity, and said, in the level voice she had come to know as his most dangerous, that he himself held cause, and that he would ask his cousin's indulgence while a witness was heard. Verity came forward with the exercise book in both hands, opened it to the candled page, and held the second sheet, in full daylight now, close enough to the window's light that the trustees might see for themselves the browned ghost writing her father had left behind, and read aloud, in a voice she kept level through sheer force of a lifetime's practice, the full accounting of what had been diverted and where, matched line by line against the ledgers Cordelia had that very hour submitted as clean. The hall did not merely go quiet, it went entirely still, 60 people holding one collective breath, and it was into that stillness that Verity turned, deliberately, to Mr. Fenn, seated pale and sweating near the trustee's table, and asked him the single question she had spent 4 days sharpening to its point, who, precisely, had instructed him to burn the true Michaelmas rentals of 8 years past, the ones that would have shown these very figures, and on whose authority had he struck the match. Fenn's composure, thin as a winter pond, went through all at once. He said her name. He said Cordelia Thorne's name twice, in a voice that cracked on the second repetition, and once begun he could not seem to stop, the whole confession spilling out of him in the particular relief of a frightened man, finally set down a weight too heavy to carry alone, naming instructions given, sums pocketed, a dismissed secretary's ruin engineered 8 years before, to cover the very first diversion Cordelia had ever made from an account she had discovered, as a young widow with nothing else of value to offer this family, that no one thought a woman capable of understanding well enough to steal from. It was the Duke, at the last, who produced the final blow. a letter in Cordelia's own hand that Verity had found among the estate's correspondence and given him 2 nights before, instructing Fen in terms too plain to survive any explanation, and he read it aloud himself, without flourish, in the same steady voice he had used to apologize to a maid in an office 3 months before, and the letters, unlike Fen's shaking testimony, could not crack or recant or weep. They simply lay there in the Duke's flat, unhurried voice, being true. Cordelia did not weep either, not at first. She sat with her gloved hands folded, very still, and it was only when Sir Robert asked her, not unkindly, whether she had anything to say for herself that something in her composure gave way all at once, and she said, in a voice stripped suddenly of all its practiced warmth, that she had buried a husband and his debts in the same year, and had watched this family's fortune pass her by at every turn for want of the one thing she had never been given, a name of her own worth keeping, and that she had told herself, at the beginning, it was only a little, only enough, only until she need not be afraid again. It was, Verity thought, watching her, the first entirely true thing the woman had said in that hall, and it did not excuse her, and it did not, watching her hands finally still in her lap, fail to move something like pity in the room either. The Duke, when he spoke again, did not call for a magistrate's warrant or a public trial, though the law would have granted him one, he said, instead. And Verity understood this too as a kind of mercy she had not expected him capable of 3 months before, that the bequest's good name and the county's boys deserved better than the scandal a public prosecution would visit on them all, and that Cordelia Thorne would leave Rexford Hall within the week for a small house in Bath, on an allowance sufficient to keep her from want and insufficient. Ever again, to tempt her, her crime known in full to the trustees and buried, by their mutual and recorded agreement, from the wider county's ears, for the sake of the innocent rather than the guilty. Miss Fen, who had cracked and told the truth when it cost him everything to do it, was given, by the same mercy, a smaller farm 2 counties distant and a chance, Sir Robert noted dryly, that most men who lied for money were never offered twice. It was 3 days later, in the library's north alcove where so much of it had begun, that the Duke found Verity returning the exercise book to its shelf for what she told him would be the last time, since her father's name had that morning been formally cleared before the same bench that had once condemned it, and she had no further cause, she said, to remain in a house that owed her nothing more. He said that he disagreed with her accounting. He said that the house owed her, by his own reckoning, a great deal more than it could ever repay in wages or apologies, and that he had come, in fact, not to discharge a debt, but to ask a question that had nothing to do with debts at all. And would she do him the kindness of answering it as plainly as she had answered him in French, in a drawing-room, on the 1st of August? She told him, with the composure that had carried her through 8 years of quiet grief and 3 months of open peril, that she would try. He said that he loved her, not for her father's cleverness returned to him twice over, not for the proof she had handed his family's good name, not for any debt discharged between them, but simply and only because she was, in his considered judgment, the finest and most honest person he had ever had the good fortune to underestimate, and that he wished her to marry him for no reason, but that she wished it too, since it was, he said, the only reason he intended to accept. Verity, who had faced down a duke's mockery and a villainess's smile, and a hall full of trustees without her voice once failing her, found it failed her now, briefly, entirely, and it was a moment before she could tell him that overlooked, her father used to say, was not the same thing as unseen, and that she had spent a great deal of her life believing she understood the difference. Until a man had stood in a drawing-room and spoken French at her, meaning to prove she was nothing, and had ended, instead, by seeing her more clearly than anyone alive. She said yes in English, plainly, and then, because some habits are worth keeping, said it again in French, and watched him laugh the same rusty, surprised laugh she had first coaxed from him over a story about a frog in a vicar's tea urn, and thought that she would not mind hearing that particular sound for the rest of her life. They were married quietly in October, in the small chapel at Rexford, rather than the grand one in the county town, with Mrs. Bramwell weeping without shame in the second pew, and declaring afterward, to anyone who would listen, that she had known it from the first evening the girl had corrected his lordship's grammar, and lived to tell of it. Sir Robert Cray stood as witness and remarked, with the dry satisfaction of a man who liked his ledgers balanced, that it was the most efficiently resolved matter to cross his bench in 20 years, a fraud uncovered, a name cleared, and a wedding besides, all inside a single season. Mr. Fenn, settled on his new farm, sent a letter that winter thanking the Duchess, as she now was, for the question that had cost him his position and, he wrote, saved whatever remained of his conscience, and asked leave to name his first calf for her, which she granted with more amusement than the occasion strictly required. Lady Honoria Vallée, who had spent the autumn's gossip convinced that Miss Aishay had schemed her way into a duchy, called on the new Duchess in November, found her composure and her candor both harder to dislike at close range than at a distance, and left, some months later, to marry a viscount in the north whose estate, everyone agreed, wanted exactly her particular gift for running a great household smoothly, a match she made, in the end, with rather more warmth than anyone had expected of her. Cordelia Thorne wrote once a year from Bath, brief, correct letters that asked after no one in particular and were answered, at the Duchess's own quiet insistence, with equal brevity and equal correctness, mercy kept alive, she said, not by affection, but by the plain refusal to let old cruelty curdle into new ones. Verity's father's name was carved, that winter, into a small stone plaque in the chapel that listed every steward and secretary who had served the house honestly, restored to a column he should never have been struck from, and she went to read it some mornings before anyone else in the house was awake, tracing the letters with one finger, and told him in the particular privacy of a graveyard errand that the accounts had balanced at last, in the end, as he had always sworn they would. A year turned nearly full circle before the county gathered again for the 1st of August ball, the anniversary, though no one but the Duke and Duchess marked it as such, of the evening a mockery in French had first crossed a drawing-room and been answered in kind. The heat that summer pressed just as heavy as it had the year before, and a robin sang its small evening business somewhere beyond the terrace doors exactly as it had then, indifferent to the turning fortunes of the house it nested against. The Duke found his wife by the window where she had once stood with a tray of negus in her hands, and asked her, this time in a voice meant for her alone, rather than for the room's amusement, whether she recalled the last occasion he had addressed her in French in that very spot. She said that she recalled it rather well, and that she trusted he did not mean to test her again. He said that he did not, that he had learned his lesson thoroughly enough the first time, and that he wished only to say, in the language that had first shown him how badly he had misjudged her, that he loved her, and that he had never in his life been so glad to be corrected in front of 40 witnesses. She laughed, the low, easy laugh she had learned to give freely only in the year since, and told him that she would take the sentiment either in French or in truth, since she had long ago stopped finding much difference between the two where he was concerned, and he said that he hoped she never would. If a story like this one has ever warmed the room you are sitting in, some quiet corner where a lamp is burning low and the kettle has gone a little cool at your elbow, then perhaps you will forgive an old habit of asking one small thing before the fire burns down further tonight. Tell me, if you would, which line stayed with you longest, the one spoken in French across a crowded room, or the one spoken plainly, later, when no one else was listening. And if you have found, as Verity did, that being overlooked is never quite the same as being unseen, stay a while by this hearth. There is always a chair kept for you here, and the door is never barred. And subscribing costs nothing but keeps your place by the fire for the next story we tell. Sleep well tonight, and be a little gentler if you can, with the ones the world has taught to make themselves small. You may find, as this house did, that they were never small at all, only waiting to be asked the right question, in whichever language you have the courage to ask it.